Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in with me on this live tonight. Tamika, thank you so much for joining in with me and tagging everyone that you tag. I appreciate you so much. As we let Facebook indicate to others that we're on, um, I'm gonna I tag a few people in. Charlene Rainey, thank you so much for joining in. I pray that each and every person had a beautiful and blessed day today. As I always say, and I'll keep saying it, every day that the Lord gives us another chance to make it above ground is a good day. Latanya Rainey, thank you so much for joining in. Kalia, thank you so much for joining in. Kalia, I'm so happy to see you on here tonight. Taz, thank you so much. For joining in with us tonight. As I come on tonight, just to give you a word of encouragement. Paris, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. As I come in to give you a word of encouragement on tonight from God, I really believe today is gonna be a awesome word. Pat, thank you so much for joining in. Pat, I'm so glad to see you on here on tonight. Um, as always, I ask each and every person if you will go ahead and Javon, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. If you will go ahead and tag some people in, share the video, like the video, whatever you can do to help the video get more reach, I truly appreciate it. Um, so with that being said, tonight I want to talk about your time is coming. Um, your time is coming. I had started off, we was talking about a little bit on last week. I was talking about the boy Mahivashaf, which was Saul's grandson and Jonathan's son. And a turn of events had happened in this boy's life that caused him to have that caused him to be lame at the age of 5. And God had been speaking to me, and God says in his process, there's going to be a lot of moving pieces in this life that we live. This life is going to have ups and downs, changes and turnarounds, but God says, I promise you, your time is coming. Sometimes we don't understand what God is doing with us and what God is allowing us to go through, but God says, don't worry, your time is coming. And as I begin to look, I'm gonna give you a little backstory of Mahibashah. First of all, God in the Bible, when it talks about the boy, it just tells us. Most people just says the boy that was crippled from the age of 5. It tells you his story that his grandfather and his father had been killed, and J-Raz came and told a nurse. So a nurse was taking care of Mahibashaf, and what he was telling them that Saul and Jonathan had been killed. So when the nurse heard this news, what she did was she picked the boy up to run, and she ends up dropping him. Now the beauty of this story is, y'all, when I read it, is they never tell you this boy name until they tell you what happened to the boy. And as I began to read the story and I began to meditate on this story, God said there's a lot of moving pieces in life. Sometimes we're going to win. Sometimes we're going to lose. Sometimes we're going to have a up and sometimes we're going to have a down. But we know our time is coming. God is saying there's a lot of moving pieces to this thing that we call life. And God is saying to us, sometimes God has to allow your testimony to be told before your name can be spoken in a room. What do I mean by that? When they talk about Mahivashaf, all they tell you is that the nurse, she fled with Mahibashaf because she heard the bad news of Jonathan and Saul had been killed. So she wanted to save Mahibashaf, and what she did was she picked them up. Now they never tell you, they just talk about this boy. They talk about this nurse. They tell you his whole story. And before they finish, after they tell you his whole story, they tell you what his name is. Now, let me tell you something, y'all. Sometimes people will describe you by the situation and circumstance that went on in your life. And I was saying, and I was asking God, I says, God, why uh didn't they tell who you were talking about? God is saying sometimes I need them to tell your story before I tell them your name, because if I tell them your name first, then think they already know your story. So, y'all, sometimes when people are talking about you and they're describing you by the things that have happened, Pierre, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. And they're describing you by the situation and circumstance and a chain of events that happen in your life. God is saying, I'll allow them to tell your story before I allow them to know your name. Because God says your time is coming. God says, if I tell them who you are, then they'll already feel like they already know your story. So God says, I have to tell them your story before I tell them your name. So as I was looking at this, and the nurse, she dropped him when he was a little bitty kid, and he broke his 2 legs. But let me tell you something. I looked at the nurse, and the nurse was trying to save him from destruction, and she dropped him. But one thing that I like about this nurse, at least she dropped him and she picked him back up. God is saying, sometimes we're dropped in life, and the people that drops us won't even reach back and pick us up. But it was Mephibosheth's time. Mephibosheth was dropped, but she picked him back up to carry him to safety. And so as I began to look at this story, I began to look, and I said, that's got to be hard that at a very young age, the boy had been dropped, and it caused him some instabilities in life. It caused him to struggle in some areas of his life. It also, I'm quite sure it brought him some shame, and I'm quite sure it made him feel less than who he was, because now the way he started in life is not the way he's ending life. But God says your time is coming. God says, I'm going to allow some people to tell your story before they can even speak your name into some rooms, because your time is coming. And as I began to look at this story, I began to look at this boy, and I began to ask God. I says, God, he was so young, and he was dropped at an early age. And God is saying, a lot of times we don't realize the first time we got dropped is at a young age, but because we were never picked back up, we feel like our time is not coming. So as I look at this story, so he gets dropped, and the lady runs off with him. So what Mephibosheth does is he has to go through life. Linda, thank you so much for joining in. He has to go through life being lame. Linda Boo, thank you so much for joining in. And God is saying, don't worry, your time is coming. God is saying there's a lot of moving pieces to life. And if you notice, we go through so many things in life that sometimes we can't believe we really made it this far. But God is saying your time is coming. And God began to show me, he says, the same way the boy was dropped, God says in due time, you are going to be picked back up. Because sometimes we don't realize that being dropped at a young age can have a long-term effect on life. Lynn, thank you so much for joining in. But God is saying your time is coming. And so as I began to look, and it really made me start to think on the process. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining in with us. The process of life, there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of components that goes to this thing called life. Now, let's just go back. Mephibosheth, this boy was young. And when they talk about him, they just says the boy that was dropped at birth, and he was lame from birth. And they says that, his grandfather had been killed and his father had been killed. And when they got the news that they had been killed, this nurse that was taking care of him, she ran in haste and she dropped him and she broke his legs from a child. But notice they tell Mephibosheth's story, but they never say his name. God is saying you're being talked, your story is being talked about in rooms that you don't even know is talked about. He says, but I won't allow them to I won't allow them to say your name until the time has come. Because if I tell them your name without telling them your story, then they'll get it twisted and feel like they already know the story. But God is saying your time is coming. God is saying your name is about to ring in places that you never imagined they would be ringing in. So now what happens is David, he's king now, and David asks the question, is there anybody left from Saul and Jonathan's house? Because because what happens is, because Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan and the grandson of Saul, Mephibosheth was due in line to get the next mantle. But because the grandfather and the father had been killed, David is now the king. So 9 times out of 10, if they ask if anybody is left from your household, normally it is to kill you so that they can possess the mantle for themselves. But God is saying your time is coming. So David asks this question, and he asks, is there anybody left from the lineage of Saul and from the lineage of Jonathan? And what the messenger tells David, he says, yes, there is somebody left, but he never tells David his name. He tells David his story. God is saying, your story is about to be told to the nations. Your story is about to reach many people. Your story is about to go viral without even saying your name. God says your time is coming. So when he asks, is anybody left? Then they tell David, yes, there's a boy, but he's crippled. Now, he knew his name, but he tells him about his issue. There's a lot of moving pieces to life. And sometimes people think that because they describe you by your issues, that defines your life. God says your time is coming. God says, I'm going to allow them to tell your story without saying your name, because I'm about to put you in great places. I can't let them know who you are just yet. I need them just to understand your story. Because if I tell them your name first, then they'll get it twisted that they know all about you. And God says, listen, I just want them to know your story before I put you at the table that I have already prepared for you. Your time is coming. God is saying you can't disqualify who God has called to the table. Remember that. That's why God doesn't tell your name before he tells your story, because a lot of people, if they find out your name, they'll try to disqualify your calling that came from God. So God says, I'm not going to tell them your name, but I'll allow them to tap into your story. You know, sometimes when God tells them your story and they hear that you got this going on and that going on, they already disqualify you from having a seat at the king's table. God says your name is about to go places that only I can take your name to. God says when you got to realize that I'm not putting your name in the atmosphere for everybody to grab a hold to, because I got to give them your story first, because guess what? God gets the glory out of your story. And I don't want them to get it twisted and think they already know the story, because God says your time is coming. Thank God for our time. So as I begin to read this story and I begin to look at the issues that the young man had suffered at an early age. Now he's 5 years old and he's dropped by his nurse. And what happens is both of his legs are broken, so he becomes disabled. Now, there has to be a hard blow for a child at 5 years old when life that you knew as normal becomes crushing. God says there's a lot of moving pieces to this thing we call life. There's going to be highs and there's going to be lows. There's going to be ups and there's going to be down. There's going to be times when you feel like you can't make it. But God says, baby, if you can hold on, I promise you there's a table that is prepared for you. And they're already talking about you, but I just can't tell them your name because they feel like if I tell them your name, they can complete your story. But I'll just give them a brief description of what you're going through. And when they look at you, they're going to say, if it wasn't for God, where would you be? When they look at you, is they going to say, but God could have brought him through that, or but God could have brought her through that. So now we look at the story, and David, now he asks them, he says, listen, I need to know, God is saying, I'm seeking people to find you, to bless you. God is saying, you might have been dropped. Thank you, Nisi, for joining in. God says, you might have been dropped, but you didn't break me. See, it's a difference in being dropped and being broken. I can be dropped, but the problem comes when you break me. God says because they drop you, they did not break you. What didn't they break? They did not break the calling that God had on your life. They did not break God from saying that before I formed thee, I knew thee. God is saying your name is in places and you really don't even understand how big the blessing is behind your name. But I'm not going to dare tell them your name before I show them your story, because I need all the glory from your story so that they'll know that I am the great I am, so that they'll know that I am who I say I am. You got people right now today, they losing this and they losing that, and people dropping them on the left and people dropping them on the right. But God is saying they can drop you, but thank God they can't break the calling that I got on your life. God is saying your time is coming. TT, thank you so much for joining in. God is saying they can drop you, but they can't stop your future. Remember, God says, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of good and not of evil, for you can have a prosperous and expected end. God says they can drop you, but they can't stop your future, because I have an expected end for your future. God is saying they can drop you, but they can't break you. God is saying you're not Humpty Dumpty who sat on the wall. Even though you fall, I'm not looking for man to put you back together, because I told him your story before I told him your name. So your story is going to represent that nobody but God put her back together again. Thank God that your time is coming. You caused me to fall, but you couldn't break my calling. God is saying, thank God that your time is coming. And so as I began to look at this story, David, he starts to look for anybody that's left from Saul and Jonathan's lineage. God is saying you don't realize that the right person is looking for you based off of your story. He says, but your time is coming. And so he looks for anybody that's left at this table. Now check it out. When they come back and give David the report, they describe the kid's issue. Never says that it is someone who's left from Jonathan and Saul lineage. What they say is it's a boy left and he's crippled. Thank God, God allows them to tell your story before they even say your name, because they don't realize that your name is carrying a blessing that came from God and not from man. It wasn't that he was important because of Jonathan and Saul. He was important because God says your time is coming. Because God says, I'm going to put your name in the atmosphere. And before I allow them to say your name, I'm going to let them tell your story. Because your story has so much glory behind it, but your story is wrapped up in God's purpose and calling for your life. Thank God, your time is coming. So now David says, listen, I'm looking for someone. I'm looking for someone that belongs to Saul and Jonathan. Now check it out. Normally in those times, those customs, if we looking for you, we looking to kill you. But David never tells them what he wants with the person that's left. He just tells them, I'm looking for someone. God says, I'm looking for someone who's not scared to praise my name. I'm looking for someone who will tell them, if it wasn't for God on my side, I don't know where I would be. God says, I'm looking for someone that's placed down in the pit, but they got to come from the pit to the prison in order to make it to the palace. God says, I'm looking for someone who's going to the Red Sea and don't know how they going to get across. God says, I'm going to tell them your story before I tell them your name, because your story is wrapped up in my glory. Thank God your time is coming. So David says, I'm looking for someone. I'm looking for someone. God says, when I send someone to bless you, you can't run from what a blessing that I sent from you. He says, but I'll allow your name to be looked for. God says, before I even show them who you are, I'll allow your story to be told, and I'll keep your name a secret until your time comes. God says, I couldn't tell him what his name was first. Because when you start telling people what your name is, they start judging you based upon who your family was. Because think about it. Saul had been demoted from God. Saul wanted to kill David. So if God would have started telling them this is Jonathan's son and David's grandson, people will link you to the stories of your family, and they think they will disqualify you based off of your name. God says, I'm not telling them your name first. I need to tell them your story. And the reason I'm going to tell them your story first is because I need them to know that the glory goes to God. So what he says is, this boy has been dropped at the age of 5, but thank God the fall didn't kill him. This boy has been damaged at the age of 5, but thank God I sent somebody to look for him. This boy has been damaged at the age of 5, but thank God his story is ringing out there, and I've already prepared a table for him to sit at. Thank God for your story. Life has a lot of moving pieces. You never understand unless you go through the process. And what I mean by the process, life has ups and downs, changes and turnarounds, good days, bad days. Sometimes you crying tears, sometimes you smiling. Life has a lot of moving pieces, but God says, if you can trust me with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding, you'll understand why your story had such significance behind your name. Thank God your time is coming. And so as I begin to look, and so David is looking for somebody who is left from Jonathan and Saul's house. They give a description of who the person is, because at some point in time, people will define you based upon your story. But God says, when they see you again, they'll know if it had not been for God who had his hand on her life, we don't know where she would have been. We knew her story, but we don't know how she got out the pit and came to the palace. God says, I won't tell them your name until I let them see your story. God says, sometimes if you think about faith is something that you cannot see. So I can't show them who you are I just have to let them hear your story. Because if I tell them your name, they'll already think they put the pieces together. Thank God your time is coming. So God sends David, and he says, he tells David, he says, David asks, he says, I'm looking for someone. He says, I'm looking for someone. He tells him, so the man tells him, he says, listen, he says, there is one boy and he has this deformity, and he's in Lodabar. And if you know anything about Lodabar, Lodabar was a desolate place. It was like a poor, poverty-ridden place. So Mephibosheth right now is in the place where he's been dropped. And he finds himself shamed and embarrassed about the things that happen in his life. And God is saying, it's not your fault that you were dropped. But thank God that somebody picked you up, because even though Mephibosheth's nurse dropped him, she picked him right up. God says, thank God when you drop, I pick you back up. And so now they tells him he's in a place called Lodabar. And he's saying, so they tell him, and David says, go get him. He says, go get him. God is telling someone right now, I'm looking for you. You can come out of Lodabar because of what happened to you. Sometimes what happens to us make us feel like we qualify to sit in low places. But God says you above only and not beneath. God says, Mephibosheth, you coming back. You're the head and not the tail. God says, listen, I'm looking for you because I want you to know that I didn't let them know your name first. I told them your story because you're more than a conqueror. God says, I'm looking for you because I got a plan. I had a plan for you before I formed you in your mother's womb. God says, I'm looking for you because the work that I began in you, I'm faithful enough to perform it. God is saying, I'm looking for you because the greater one is inside of you. Greater is he that's in me than he that's in the world. Thank God my time is coming. So now David tells them to go get Mephibosheth. Now, let me tell you something about life and how life is set up. Right now, we got social media. So now social media is a big thing. But sometimes God says they don't even need to know your name on social media. Just give them your story because your time is coming. God is saying, don't worry about the likes and the shares and all that because your time is coming. He says, if I don't let them see your story, they can't understand the glory behind your name. Remember, God told Abraham, I will make your name great and you will be a father of many nations. Abraham didn't see the blessing that he was about to get, but God says, listen, Abraham, I got to let him know your story. I got to let them know that I told you to leave your family and then go to a place that I'm trying to show you because I've already prepared a time and I've already prepared a place. Just because of what you go through don't mean that defines you. God says, if I qualify you, nobody can disqualify you from sitting at the table with the kings. Thank God my time is coming. And so as I begin to look at this story, and David, he's looking for somebody. He's looking for this boy. He says, listen, bring him here. He says, bring him here. See, who's that? Ramir, thank you so much for joining in. David says, listen, he says, because I'm a man after God's own heart. And David says, I understand how the game goes. But David says, because I'm a man after God's own heart. And David says, I remember there was some times when I was in the creek and God had to pull me out. David says, I remember when they disqualified me from being king. And when they asked my father, did he have another son? See, y'all, I'm going somewhere for y'all. Remember when they came looking for a king in David's father Jesse's house? Jesse didn't even think enough of David to bring him in the lineup. And when they poured the oil wouldn't pour. They asked Jesse, is there somebody else around here? He says, yes, I have a younger boy. Remember, he left David out in the field attending to the sheep and attending to the flock. See, God says, I'll allow them to leave you at a place until your time comes. And what they tell Jesse is, bring that young boy out the field and bring him in the house. Because God says there's a king inside of this house. You don't understand that your name has so much glory behind your story. See, remember, David was a young boy tending to the sheep and tending to the flock. They didn't even think David was qualified to be in the house at the time that they said, Jesse, bring all your sons into the house. God says they can't disqualify you when I call you, because your time is coming. God said there's a prepared place and there's a set time where your name is going to get glory behind your story. Thank God for glory. So they tell Jesse, they says, call that young boy in the house. Now check it out. Mephibosheth, he was a 5 years old when his nurse tried to flee with him and she dropped him. So Mephibosheth has some similarities to David because both of them was dropped at a young age. Some say the reason Jesse didn't bring David in the house is because of some things that Jesse had did, and he was trying to hide what he had did. Be careful of those people you try to hide because of your secrets. Thank God my time is coming. So David understands. He says, listen, I'm a man after God's heart. And there's been times when I haven't always been right with God. But because I trust the Lord with all my heart and I lean not to my own understanding, David says, I understand that we're going to go through some dark times, but I understand the Lord is a rod, a staff, and a comforter. David says, I understand that the Lord is my salvation. David says, I understand all the things that God is doing. David says, so because I connect with God's heart, and God is saying, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of good and not of evil. He says, I think good thoughts of anybody who's left behind from Saul and Jonathan's house. Even though, if you know the story, Saul tried to kill David several times. But David says, because I'm a man after God's own heart, I need to know how to think like God. My ways have to line up like God's ways. God says, so what David says, he says, I'm looking for somebody. Not knowing that this boy has been left behind because he was dropped. He's in the lowest place of his life. Thank God when you at the bottom of the pit, thank God that he'll pull you out. So David says, I'm looking for somebody. Really don't know who I'm looking for. Y'all better thank God that God will send a person that you really know nothing about to look for you when you in your darkest moments in time. Remember, David says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me, my rod, my staff, and my comforter. So David is saying, it's somebody that God wants me to look for. Because I understand that when I was a child, I was put to tend the field. I was left behind. David says, so because I know the heart of God, there's somebody that I need to reach. Thank God for the people who reaching more people with the word of God. Because God's saying, you got to know how to reach people with my word. You got to know how to send for people based off of the process that I have you in. This process has a lot of moving pieces. Life has ups and downs and changes and turnarounds, but I'm going to tell you, if you hold on to God's hand, you can be hiding in the field, but God says your time is coming. God says when I send them to look for you, they'll understand your story without knowing your name. Y'all thank God that God has to show your story before he tells your name. David was out there tending to the field. They asked Jesse specifically, bring all your boys into the house. Jesse acted like he had forgot about David because of something he did. God says, just keep pouring the oil until it flows, because I'm looking for a king. He says, I need you to keep pouring the oil because I'm looking for a king. When the oil wouldn't flow in Jesse's house, the messenger, he asked Jesse, is it anybody else around here that I haven't seen? Jesse has to come clean and says, yes, I got a young boy that's out there in the field. He says, well, bring him in the house. It's David's time to be shown as king. Now, David didn't move directly into being a king, but it was his time to be revealed. God says the reason I haven't brought you to the forefront yet is because I need them to understand your story is wrapped in the glory of God. And when I tell them your name is going to be great. Every blessing that I promise you, you're going to get it. So David says, I'm looking for somebody. Don't know who I'm looking for. He says, but I'm on a mission. He says, I need to know who's left behind from Saul's and Jonathan's house. David says, because I'm a man after God's own heart, I got to do the things that God called me to do. There's a process to life. There's a lot of moving pieces. David understood that when he was a kid, that he was hidden until the time comes. David is now a king, so he understands how the process goes. So he says, I'm looking for somebody. So they tell him to go get Mephibosheth out of Lodabar. Now, Mephibosheth is in Lodabar. He's at the lowest place of his life. And only thing they can describe to David is his condition and not his name. So they tells David, yes, there's a young man. By this time, Mephibosheth is grown. I believe he's a grown man now. Thank you, Dota, for joining in. By this time, I believe Mephibosheth, he's a grown man. Mephibosheth is on crutches. He's still in the condition that they tell David that he's in, because they describe him by his condition and they don't describe him by his blessing, because God says you just don't understand the story behind Mephibosheth and that his name is wrapped into a blessing. So he allows them to tell David Mephibosheth's story, but David says, bring him to me. Now, not knowing at that time, I can imagine Mephibosheth is looking like, listen, I'm at the lowest point in my life. I've been dropped as a kid, and now I'm on crutches. And I guess he says I'm in Lodabar. I'm at the lowest point of life, living my life the best that I can. And he says, who would have even known that I was here? But God says, I'm seeking somebody to find you because your name has to be great. So what David says is he tells them, go get him. Now I can imagine Mephibosheth is probably thinking like, they about to kill me because I'm still in the lineage of Saul and I'm still in the lineage of Jonathan. And most of the time, in order for them to possess the full mantle, they have to kill everybody in the bloodline in order for them to be fully possess the mantle. So he probably thinks, I've been dropped, I've been hurt, I've been broken. He says, now I'm about to be killed. I could just imagine he's thinking, not knowing that his story has glory behind it. Not knowing that because David was connected to your grandfather and your father. See, you got to understand something. David and Jonathan was best friends. Now, David was in the army of Saul. Saul got mad because David killed Goliath and they started to brag about it. Saul decides, I'm going to kill David because David is trying to get recognition. David never asked for recognition, but Saul got jealous because he felt like David was trying to take too much credit for killing Goliath. So David and Jonathan was best friends. David loved Saul, but Saul wanted to kill him. Sometimes your family enemies is going to be the one that's going to bless you. God says the name behind the story has so much glory that I can't tell them your name just yet. I have to let them hear your story. So what he does is he goes and get him and he tells him, he says, listen, he tells Mephibosheth, y'all, this how good God is. David, when he goes and gets him, he tells him, listen, This man, I'm going to take care of him. He says that he has a seat at my table. Your time is coming. What I'm trying to tell you, there's a process to life. Sometimes you're going to be dropped, but God says, I'll pick you up. Sometimes the road is not going to seem smooth. It's going to be rocky. God says, but I'll make every crooked place straight. God says, if you need rest, he says, come to me because I care about you. So what he does is David understands that I need to bless Mephibosheth from the place that he's at now, not based upon his condition, but based upon his name. See, God is saying, before I let them know your name, I'm going to tell them your story. Because if I tell them your name first, then they're going to think they already know the story and not understand the glory that comes behind his name from God. So what happens is David sits them at a table. Now, y'all, let me tell you something. David prepares a table and tells them, this man will sit at my table forever and he will be blessed. David says that everything that belongs to his father and grandfather, I'm going to give it to him. See, sometimes you think that because your family had enemies, that God won't bless you. God says, I'll use the people that your family had odds with to bless you. Why I say that? God says, I'll prepare a place in the presence of your enemies and I'll sit you at the table. He says, and I'll anoint your head with oil. He says, your cup will run over. Now, let me tell you something about that cup running over. Some of y'all look at it as like when the sink flows over. If a sink flows over, everything that's in the sink has to come out. Some people don't understand that God got people that's flowing over, and because it's going to wet your feet. See, if you in a place where a sink or a flood takes place, your feet get wet. God says, I'm about to bless you from an overflow of somebody else. I'm trying to show y'all something. This is David who wrote the 23rd Psalms. He says, God will prepare a place in the presence of your enemies. He'll anoint your head and your cup will run over. David's cup was running over and he was about to bless Mephibosheth because Mephibosheth's time had come and he was in the right place at the right time to receive a blessing. Y'all better tell some people, listen, I ain't got to be the cup, but I can just be around the cup. Because when y'all understand that God is the cup and he'll run it over, as long as you got a relationship with God, and I'm around at the time when God calls my name, God will run the cup over and bless me. Because what did David say? Surely goodness and mercy shall follow you throughout the days of your life, and you will dwell in the house of the Lord. Mephibosheth, goodness and mercy. Mephibosheth, you had a condition that people thought describe your life, but they didn't understand that goodness and mercy was chasing you down. When David says, I'm looking for someone, he says, I'm looking for someone because goodness and mercy has to run Mephibosheth down. He says, Mephibosheth, you're not defined by your condition. Don't let nobody start writing your story based upon what they see. God says, I'm going to show you what you see, but you don't really understand what's connected to what you see. You don't understand that the overflow is connected to the boy with the disability. You don't understand the overflow is connected to the woman who's been broken. You don't understand that the overflow is connected to the woman that's been dropped. You don't understand that the overflow is connected to the man that's been dropped. You don't understand that the overflow is connected to the man who's been talked about. You don't understand that the overflow is connected to the man who's hiding in the field. You don't understand that the blessing is connected to the darkness. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Some people sitting in the valley, and God says, as long as you go through the valley, you can't be stopped. You don't understand that the man that's in the valley of the shadow of death right now, he's coming through. God says you can't stop him because I'll tell you his story before I show you his name. God said your time is coming. He says your time is coming. He says your time is coming. He says, I couldn't tell them your name without showing them your story, because your story was connected to God's glory. And if I would have told them your name before I told them your story, then they wouldn't understand that the glory belongs to God. Remember when they threw Jonathan in the pit, and Jonathan told him, listen, I'm just trying to bless you according to the vision and the dream that God has given me. Joseph. And he told him, he says, I'm trying to bless you according to the dream and the vision that God has given me. Joseph got so many moving pieces in the process, but Joseph held on. Joseph says, don't worry, I'll see you in the end. And when Joseph came to the end of the process, when it was time for Joseph to be shown, because guess what? They thought when they dropped Joseph in the pit, Joseph was finished. Potiphar's wife thought when she lied on Joseph that Joseph was going to the prison. They thought Joseph was finished. But when they seen Joseph again, because remember, God says, I know the plan that I think towards you. Thoughts of good and not of evil. Thoughts for you to have a prosperous and expected end. But God says there's a lot of moving pieces to the process. Life going to take you through some ups and downs, some changes and turnarounds. You're going to go on a journey in this life. But God says, I promise you, your story your condition that happened within your story does not define the blessing that is attached to your name. So when Jonathan, he got through in the pit, y'all remember that? Because he told the family, he says, I'm going to feed you through a phantom. So what happens is Jonathan at the end, Joseph, I don't know why I keep saying Jonathan. Joseph was when they got to the phantom, Joseph was sitting there and Joseph wept. And they told Joseph, they says, please forgive us. I think they said that, they told Joseph, they says, our father wanted you to forgive us for what we had done to you. And Joseph says, now y'all check this out. What you meant for evil, God turned it around for my good. What you meant for evil, God turned it around for my good. What you meant for evil by telling them the story that she had been dropped, by telling them the story that she had been broken, by telling them the story that he had to be in the field. You thought that was going to stop the calling on my life. You may have dropped me, but you didn't break the calling that God has on my life. What you meant for evil, God says, I'm going to turn it around for your good. See, what they thought was when David says, I'm looking for someone from Saul or Jonathan's house, they figured if I tell you his condition, then you won't want him no more. So they tell him that, yes, there's somebody, but he's disabled because he was dropped at birth. God says what they meant for evil, Mephibosheth, I'm going to turn it around for your good. Because everything that was due to you in this lifetime, God says, I promise, Mephibosheth, your time is coming. You don't have to be in Lodabar no more. You don't have to sit in the lowest place of your life, because God says you can be in a valley of a shadow of death. He says, but you come on through it, and I know you won't be stopped. God says, and then while I'm bringing you through the valley, I'm preparing a place at the seat of your enemy's table. He says, and surely goodness and mercy is going to follow you. He says, but before goodness and mercy follow you, I'm going to anoint your head with oil. Your cup is about to run over. You think because you've been broken when you was a child, that stops the blessing of God? You think because you've been talked about, that stops the blessing of God? You better tell some people, first of all, before I tell you my name, let me introduce myself and give you my story. Because if you see me, you won't believe all the hell that I've been through. Tell some people before I tell you my name, because my name has such greatness from God. And I didn't make my name great. God says, I'll make your name great. I'm going to tell you my story. I'm going to tell you that, yes, I've been dropped along the way. Yes, I've been on some rocky roads. Yes, my path has been crooked. But I'm going to also tell you, God says that every crooked path, I'll make it straight. I'm going to tell you that, yes, I've had some good times and bad times. But I'm going to tell you that God says I can weep at night. But just know it's a joy coming in the morning. Yes, I've been in Lodabar at the lowest place of my life. But tell them when my time comes, God says I'll supply all your needs according to my riches. Tell them that God, that I've been in some tight spaces. But my Father who which are in heaven, he owns everything on the earth. The earth is God's and the fullness thereof. See, I got to tell you my story so that when you see me getting the glory, you'll understand that if it had not been for God on my side, I don't know where I would be. Tell him everything that was meant for evil, God says, I'm turning it around. I'm stirring the pot and I'm going to turn it around for your good. See, it's a lot of moving pieces in life. It's a lot of moving pieces in this process. And what God is beginning to tell me is, God tells me sometimes I got to take you away from social media because your story and your greatness doesn't come from the likes and the shares. He says you don't even understand the cup that's about to run over for you. He says, so what I'm going to do, I'll tell him your story before I tell him your name. God says, I'll let him hear you talk about the goodness of the Lord before I show him who you are. I'll let him hear that you looking for some people to encourage through the word of God. You looking for some people to let them know that your Lodabar days are over. You looking for some people to tell them that let them talk about you. If they place you in the pit, just expect to come to the palace. I'll tell them that everything that was done that was meant for evil, God is about to turn it around for your good. Thank God that our time is coming. Thank God that I don't have to operate off the likes and the shares of social media, because God says your story is bigger than social media. God says they don't even understand what I'm doing in your life. God says because you know how to operate in the right time at the right place, your cup is about to run over. Thank God. Thank God that God is so good. That God says, guess what? Goodness and mercy is chasing you because my word that you have hid in thy heart and everything that you got inside of you, you put it out there. God says, I'm chasing you down because you let my people know that God is still good, even when we think it's bad. God says, I'm chasing you down because greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. God says, I'm chasing you down because you're above only and not beneath. God says, I'm chasing you down because you got to show some people that you the head and not the tail. God says, I'm chasing you down because you're more than a conqueror. God says, I'm chasing you down because I knew the plan that I had for your life before I formed you in your mother's womb. God says, if I performed the great work, if I started a great work in your life when you was a child, I'm faithful to perform it to the end. God says, just keep turning in the process. See, sometimes we don't like when the storm turns us around and up and down, but God says there's a lot of moving pieces. And sometimes in life, you're going to be in the storm. But God says, trust me, there is another side. God says, if you can just hang on the boat, there is another side. Y'all, I thank God for this message and that, you know, God allows me to encourage y'all through the word of God. And I thank God that, you know, I've chosen to live my life for God and God alone, because I remember one time when I was just You know, you gotta just be real. When you was just a story, remember they said some people, when they were young, they went through challenges in their life, and people describe them as that's the bad child, or that's the child that ain't gonna be nothing, and that's the child that came from that family, and that's the child that used to be on that corner. But God says, listen, I'll allow them to tell your story before I say your name, because at the right time I'm preparing a table in the presence of the people that turned around and talked about you, because they have to understand that your story is wrapped in God's glory. When you get all twisted up in God and twisted up in God's word, you got to understand that your life becomes like God. God says you got to have the same mind as in Christ. God says, I'll allow you to tap into my mind, because I tell you, for I know the thoughts. God says, I'll tell you that my thoughts are good. So God says you're going to have to change your identity, and you're going to have to think thoughts of good and not of evil. You're going to have to say, thank God for that story. You're going to have to say, thank God for my story. You're going to have to say, thank God for her story. And you're going to have to say, thank God for his story. Because without the story, without your story, God can't get the glory. Susan, I thank you for joining in with us on tonight. Susan, I'm sorry you're a little bit under the weather, but you better now. Thank you so much for joining in, Susan. You could go back and watch the live later. I think this is a really good message that God had given me, that your time is coming. And what I'll begin to say, Susan, is sometimes people define you by the things that you've been through in your life. And I was talking about Mephibosheth. He was dropped at birth. So only thing they knew how to describe Mephibosheth by as being a boy who was lame from birth, who was dropped by a nurse, and he was crippled as a kid. What they did was they defined Mephibosheth by the situations and circumstances that had took place in his life, but they didn't understand that Mephibosheth's story had so much glory that was wrapped up into God, that God says, I'll allow them, Mephibosheth, to only tell your story. I won't even let them say your name yet. Your name is important, because there's a time and a place that I'm going to sit you at a table where I'm going to bless you in front of the same people that told your story, for them to understand that the glory comes from God and God alone. So when you get time, Susan, go back and look at the rebroadcast. I think it'll bless you. And y'all, with that being said, I thank each and every one of you all who joined on tonight. Y'all time is coming. Sometimes you're gonna have to stop fighting with people about telling your story. Just stop. Let them tell it. Because if they don't tell your story, then they'll already figure out that God is done with you and he has no more for you. So guess what? Sometimes you got to let them describe you the way they see you, because they don't see you the way God sees you. You got to let them tell a story the way they see fit, because they don't see you the way God sees you. But you know what? When you turn around and you tell them, my cup is about to flow over in the presence of my enemies, you understood my story. And I'm glad you understood my story, because my story was wrapped in God's glory. But you really didn't realize what my name was, because God says that, listen, I'll make your name great. Remember what he told Abraham, you'll become a father of many nations. Tell him, you better try to understand my story before you understand my name. Because my name don't mean as much as my story until the time comes. God says when the time comes, they'll understand how your story and your name went together. You know, and as I was looking at it, y'all, and I'm going to close out in 1 minute. You know, sometimes when you tell a person your name and they'll try to define you by who you related to. Notice that they never said Mephibosheth's name. They just said Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson. He was dropped at birth by a nurse, because the nurse heard that the grandfather and the father had been killed. She jumped up in haste and she dropped him. They never said his name until the end. They told his name after they told the story. God says I can't allow people to try to tell your story, to try to say your name before they know your story. Because then if I tell them your name before I tell them your story, then they'll think they know everything about you. God says your story has so much glory that I'll let them wonder what your name is. God says, but right now, y'all better believe it. Some of y'all names is in places, high places. I'm not talking about lullaby places. Some of your names is in places waiting for you to catch up to the time that God is going to bring you at the table and sit you before great men. Some of your names is already being talked about because God says there's a time and I've already prepared a place where your name is going to match your story. So y'all, with that being said, I thank you so much on tonight. Thank you, Tamika, Paris, Javon. Javon said, I can't fight against anything that. Oh, he said you can't fight against anything that God got for you. That's right, Javon. You can't fight against it. And God just began to tell me to tell his people that your time is coming. Now, are you going to have ups and downs? Yes. I don't want to get on here and fool you and tell you that you're going to go from the pit and jump up to the palace. No, that ain't how it go. Because God says in this world, you will have trials and tribulations. But God says, if you learn to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding, acknowledge God in all your ways. He says he'll direct your path. All those moving pieces in your life, that whole process, if you acknowledge God in all your ways, he says he'll direct your path. God says, but you got to give me your whole heart when you're going through the process, not some of it, but all of it. God says, keep the faith, because he says faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. God says you ain't even seen the table yet. He said, but you keep your hope that he's already prepared the place for you. God is saying that he just needs y'all to trust him. He said, yes, you're going to walk through. He said, normal, walk through the valley of the shadow of death. If you walking through something, you can't be stopped. Never told you to stop at the valley. He says you come on through it. He says, because guess what? When you come through it, he says you hold on to your rod, your staff, and your comforter. He says, and then guess what? He says, I'll prepare you a place in the presence of your enemies. He says, I'll anoint your head, your cup runneth over. He says, and surely goodness and mercy will be waiting there for you all the days of your life, and you will dwell in the house of the Lord. Y'all got to remember, when you coming through, you better expect that there's an end to this stuff. When you coming through, you better expect that my cup is about to run over. When you coming through, you better be like David and say, because my cup is about to run over, I'm about to flow this run over on more than just me. Because see, David understood that I'm blessed right now. He says, but I understand that God has created me to bless somebody else at this time too. So y'all, when I come on here and I give the word, what I'm giving y'all, I'm giving y'all what's inside of me. I want y'all to run over with this word, because when your cup start filling up, you better tell them you didn't understand my story before you seen this cup run over. You better tell them you don't understand my connection before my cup ran over. You don't know the valley that I had to keep going through in order to get to this table, to get to the run over point in my life. So y'all, with that being said, Markeisha Stewart, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. To, like I said, Tamika, Paris, I see my mom, I see my Trina, thank you so much. My auntie Linda, both of my auntie Lindas, I seen y'all on here. Pierre's on here. Susan, thank you so much for joining in. Latanya, Charlene, as always, thank you all so much for joining in. Nisi and TT, thank you so much for joining in. I see my daughter Zizi and Kiki, they were on here. Thank you so much for joining in with us tonight. Paris, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. Oh, Ramir Curtis, thank you so much for joining in. Y'all, our time is coming. Our time is coming. Let them tell your story. Because they ain't seen the glory that is wrapped up into your story. Pat, thank you so much for joining in. Oh, Lil June, thank you so much for joining in. Got Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining in with us on YouTube. Him and Linda, thank y'all so much for holding it down on YouTube. Keita White, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. Y'all, I wanted to get that message out on tonight. Taz, thank you so much for joining in. I want to get that message out on tonight because you know what? God is doing some great things in each and every one of our lives. I truly believe. Yes, there's a process, but God had to tell me there's many moving pieces to this process. In this process, you're going to have to pray. In this process, you're going to find yourself where you're going to weep. In this process, but you're going to find yourself that joy is going to come in the morning. In this process of what we call life, you're going to find yourself tearing down and building up. In this process, you're going to find yourself happy, and then you're going to find yourself not so happy. In this process, you're going to find yourself up, and then you're going to find yourself down. But God says, if you can acknowledge me in all those situations, he says, I'll keep directing your path. He says, but you have to give me your whole heart. He says, if you can acknowledge me with all your heart, he says, and I'll direct your path in all those situations, your up, your down, your changes, your turnarounds. God says you don't have to stay in Lodabar forever. He says, just keep acknowledging me no matter where you find yourself at. If you at the bottom of a pit, God says, acknowledge me. If you in prison, God says, acknowledge me. Because remember, Paul and Silas, they went to prison, but they realized I got to acknowledge God at a certain time of the day. And what they did was they said they waited until nighttime came to acknowledge that God was good. And they started praising until something happened. They started praising until shackles started breaking. They started praising until chains started being broken. They started praising until their cup ran over. They started praising until goodness and mercy followed them throughout the days of their life. See, you got to know that your process does not define your story. Your process does not stop the calling that God has on your life. Paul used to persecute Christians. Now Paul is preaching to Christians. God says, listen, your best days ain't came. God says your time is coming. So with that being said, I want to thank each and every one of you all once again. Thank you, Pat, so much for joining in with us. Markeisha, thanks so much for joining in. My mom and everybody who put up so many lovely comments, wonderful comments. Y'all, I promise y'all, as long as God word, as long as I keep having it in my heart, God said what's in you, pour it out. I can overflow y'all cup just by giving y'all what God has given me. As long as I keep God's word hidden in my heart and understand that the greater one is inside of me than the one that's in the world, I can overflow y'all with God's word. So with that being said, thank you so much on tonight for joining in. Each and every one of you all. As always, we just ask that you share the video out, like the video. It's not for, it's not the shares and likes is not it's not for me. It's just to help someone understand how good and how great God is and how much God is working in each and every one of our lives. And with that being said, once again, thank you all for joining in on tonight. If you would like to donate to the podcast, my husband had put up the Cash App. If not, just share the video out, like the video, love it, send it to a friend. You never know who find themselves in Lodabar at the lowest place of their life because they've been dropped. But I come on here tonight to tell them You can be dropped, but they can't break the calling off your life. And just when you think they've dropped you in the wrong place, God says, I'll pick you back up. God says, you're not Humpty Dumpty that falls off the wall and breaks. God says, I'll pick you back up. You notice Humpty Dumpty was looking for the king's men to put them back together. God says, I'll put you back together, but you got to trust me with all your heart. And with that being said, love each and every one of you. Thank each and every one of you who take the time out to tag people in the video. It's truly a blessing to see how you all work. See, we work together. We work together to flow this word out to God's people. And that's what God wants to do. God wants to see who's going to spread his great news. God wants to see at a time that the times that we living in, if the news can get on and spread all the bad news in the world, from who died to who got shot to this going on. And I'm not saying it's not necessary. But we can also get on here and we can come and say, but God still loves you. But God says, if you trust him through this process of life and just hold on, he promised you only going through this valley. You don't have to stay there. See, we got to counter the negative in the world with the positive of God. So with that being said, once again, thank you. Just thank each and every one of you all tonight. With that being said, y'all be blessed.